All right, hello everyone, and welcome to our Prisonhouse of Nations panel. At Freedom, oh my goodness, the flag just fell. They did not like my intro. Anyway, at FRSO, we find it very important to highlight all of these oppressed nationality nations, their historic struggle, and think about how we can relate not only to their history, but like the future of oppressed nationalities all over the U.S., particularly the Black nation. And so our panelists are really going to explore our line on this question and really get into how we can continue to build a revolutionary movement in this country.
For sure. I was saying before, I think they asked me to MC so that I could sing a rendition of Lift Every Voice and Sing, but then, we were talking about it, and it's like, I'm such an amazing singer that, like, people get jealous. Do you understand what I'm saying? And so I decided not to at this time. But do look it up, because if you want to hear about a spontaneous expression of a real national consciousness, yes, Black Americans have our own national anthem. Yes, we do. So my name is Syd Lovig. I'm on the standing committee of Freedom Road Socialist Organization, and also sit on the African American Commission. And I could speak for the African American Commission when I say we are internationalists. So that's why we decided to allow other oppressed nationalities to speak in Black History Month. Yeah. Yeah. We all, as comrades, have walked different paths to get here and come out of different struggles. And I came out of the Black Liberation Movement. I could say the first rally I went to was Trayvon Martin, but that's not true. The first rally I went to was an Obama rally. Does anybody remember Hope and Change? Yeah. 2008. So, we're trying to figure it out, right? We were trying to figure it out. And I really got active in kind of the first wave of Black Lives Matter, where I was around Ferguson and Mike Brown, 2014, 2015. And I was a student, so I was studying, the Black Liberation Movement, and the Panthers introduced me to Marxism. And the same thing that brought me to Marxism brought them to Marxism, which is that we're trying to solve the problems of our people, right? And then we go to the root, and we see that monopoly capitalism is at the root, right? So also, when I joined, I had a conversation with Mike Sampson, who's the chair of the African American Commission. Why did you join FRSO? Why did you join FRSO? And he said, Freedom Road is the only revolutionary group that has a correct line on the national question. Hello. So a correct line affects everything, because it affects what we decide to do and how we decide to do it, right? So just a few things to say that a correct line is actually hard won. It's not necessarily the popular thing. It's not necessarily, something that just, comes from the sky. It's blood, sweat, and tears in the movement. In debates, sometimes debates that cause blood, sweat, and tears. And in this generation of the struggle for socialism, we have if we have the wisdom to do it, we have the benefit of turning to the best experiences of socialist countries in fighting for the equality of nations and nationalities. And in the 1920s, the Communist International studied the facts of the situation in the United States and backed up the Black comrades in the old Communist Party who were fighting for a revolutionary line on the Black national question. And they won that struggle, and in the 1930s were able to leap forward in their work amongst African Americans, among sharecroppers. You can read about that. But so the Bolshevik Revolution, figured this out and really grasped this with two hands, and it was through practice, because Russia was a prison house of nations, just like the United States today. And in doing that, they really reclaimed the essence, the revolutionary essence of Marxism, because from the very beginning, Marxism said that emancipation of the working class is the emancipation of all humanity, right? And as long as nationally oppressed people are held in bondage, then workers as a class cannot be free, right? So that was the moment. That was the moment in history where that link in the chain of imperialism was broken for the first time, and that's the context where you had the struggle for socialism and the struggle for black liberation, merging in the international arena. And there were sparks, and they lit fires of rebellion across the world and in the 1960s, and were laying the foundation for black liberation and socialism in the 21st century. So the next generation of revolutionaries did not have a lot of guideposts because of the abandonment of revolution of the Communist Party, right? But what we're doing is we're recapturing our revolutionary heritage, and we're building a genuine Communist Party in this country. And a really critical part of that is upholding the right to self-determination for oppressed nations. So there's a torch, right, that others put down, and we want to pick it up and carry it into the present. And Marxism-Leninism is a tool that revolutionaries have to bring into these movements today, and that's why we're here. We're taking lessons from the past, looking towards a future, though, where we put an end to this shitty system once and for all, right? And you have to have a revolutionary line to do that, or you will end up in the weeds, right? History has taught us that as well. So we're shining a light on that today with these awesome comrades and heavy hitters in their respective movements as well, to talk about, national liberation struggles in this country, past and present. So first, I will hand it to, I call her Miss Chris. Chrisley Carpio of the Standing Committee. Yeah.
Thanks everyone for being out here tonight, and thank you for the privilege of getting to speak here on Black History Month at the Freedom Road Socialist Organization event in Minneapolis. My name is Chrisley Carpio. Like Syd said, I sit on the Standing Committee, and I live here in Minneapolis now, but I actually moved a few years ago from Florida, where the experience of marching for justice for Trayvon Martin was actually an extremely radicalizing experience. And I think about those years. It was a really fucked up case. Like, the Sanford Police Department actively covered up the murder of that boy, and he was a boy, right? He wanted to be a pilot, and hundreds and hundreds of young people marched, and years later, people are still marching, but it was a really formative experience. But I'm going to be talking here on the panel about the national question and what exactly we mean by that. It might sound kind of like an abstract term, so let's make it real. Before we talk about why national liberation is so important, let's talk about the problem that we're trying to solve, right? Why is it revolutionary? Because we're trying to get rid of imperialism. And to us, imperialism is the enemy. It's the people who benefit from putting the boots on our necks. It's the people who are the parasites that are bringing everyone down, and the people who are bringing down the people in the Black nation, but also outside of it, who, are oppressed nationalities across the U.S. Imperialism is the final stage of capitalism in our view, right? We're Marxist-Leninists. We look at things in terms of class, in terms of, things that are real. The economy is an important part of that. It's the final dying stage of the capitalists, because the way that they work is that even if there's competition at the beginning, the winners eat the losers, right? Those are not humane people. The big businesses eat the little businesses, and a few emerge as they corner the market, and we know what happens. They raise the prices, they stomp each other out, and you get your You get your JP Morgan, you get your Pepsi Cola, Coca-Cola, your General Motors, not the companies either, the families that own them, right? It's a very, very small group of people who actually benefit from the system that exists. And exploiting people in the US and just selling to people in the US is not enough for them anymore. They are the greediest, most bloodthirsty group of people who've ever existed in world history. And, you know, their predecessors in late stage feudalism and early competitive capitalism, the ruling class in those times, they relied more on colonies, right? You know, for God, gold, and glory, if people ever heard that phrase. They made a ton of money off of the selling of slaves, right? That's actually what set the stage for capitalism. Like Marx said, it came into the world covered in blood and dirt, right? And now today we're looking at its final form, right? They had their early competitive capitalism. Now there are some winners emerging after eating the losers. You actually don't need a military occupation in another country just to make the amount of money that they make now. To have imperialism, you can actually go in and dominate the whole markets, not only sell goods, but set up shop, you know, as if you belong there in those other countries, right? Exporting capital is kind of the phrase we use for that, but it means kind of, you know, using the land, labor, and resources and claiming it as your own, purposefully stamping out the rest of that country's economy just to stay on top, even kidnapping the sovereign president and first lady of another country, right? Just to maintain that kind of political control, and tools that they, you know, called the tools of free trade and globalization and all those things are actually part of this vision, right? The World Trade Organization, North American Free Trade Agreement. There's nothing free about those things because they stamped out all of the classes of these sovereign peoples who didn't even get to develop so that they could be rich. And now today they use things like sanctions and tariffs, right? They will lock you in semi-feudal conditions. They will let you suffer living as peasants and warlords, you know, or peasants suffering under the rule of warlords if it means that they can stay on top, and you know, you're the not even the bourgeoisie of that oppressed nation will thrive or get to experience modernization of anything because the U.S. imperialists have to be number one. You know, people in the Philippines don't get to have water if Coca-Cola wants to own the whole country for itself, right? And that's why it needs to be resolved with revolution, and that's why revolution is so important. Imperialism is the primary contradiction in the world today, is our view, and you can have a revolution even if it's not socialist, even for bourgeois democratic rights and self-determination. Like Amiri Baraka said, how can you be a socialist if you're not even a Democrat and a patriot, is the way he put it, right? So even if Malcolm X wasn't a socialist, he was damn well one of the finest revolutionaries that this country has ever seen, right? So that's just the big picture overview about what imperialism is. So zooming in now, the national question in the US, exploiting people abroad is not where their work stops. It's not even where it started. It started here in the US. They began their evil work here in the United States. You know, the people who set up the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, Wall Street, the founding fathers, that's who they are. They exploit and steal all the labor of the working class here, the multinational working class here, but more than that, they will deliberately underdevelop whole nations of people who actually meet the criteria for a nation and should be free, right? People who share a common culture, speak a common language, right? And this is Joseph Stalin's criteria for a nation. Have a distinct economic structure, right? One that is deliberately kind of pressed down upon by the imperialists, have geographic borders and territories. Like, you can actually find them on a map, and they're historically constituted and stable, right? So the people who wrote out this theory, Lenin and Stalin, viewed the Russian Empire as a prison house of nations. There were all these people who met that criteria, clamoring to be free, whose demands needed to be propped up and held by the revolution. And we view the United States as the same way. And there are 3 oppressed nations that we feel meet or that revolutionaries and the masses have fought for, that meet the 5 criteria: Hawaii, the Black Belt South, and Aztlan. You know, the name Aztlan, Aztec land, it actually is a name that people there recognize, and it's got a symbolic reference. People, of the Aztec, the dream of La Raza and the reality of the U.S., kind of bringing it to material reality. It's the Chicano Southwest, right? People who've been there, and kind of that's one of the poetic manifestations of kind of the vision of being united. The Black Belt South was named for the rich, dark soil of the earth there, and it should be a prosperous land. It shouldn't be so poor like it is today, but it's kept poor because of imperialism, and it's the land of African Americans, right? And you can see these things even on a map, the 2000 New York Times census map, where you trigger for the demographics. You can actually see kind of the black dense, black majority towns are concentrated across the South where slaves were brought. And then Hawaii, which is locked into the US now and made into a state, and it's treated like a launch pad into Asia. It is mostly for the US to launch its wars into Asia, right? So stomping all over the democratic rights of these peoples just for their own uses. We say that the oppressed nations should have the right to govern themselves up to and including the right to secession. So for us, self-determination is not a metaphor for freedom or anything. It's actually the material right of governance, up to and including the right to secession. Lenin compared it to divorce. How can you have this unity if you don't have the right to leave? It's fucked up and it's not real, and we need to support the right to leave. National oppression can impact you even if you don't belong to an oppressed nation, right? We actually, in our program where we lay out the self-determination demands, we raise demands too for oppressed national minorities who, like Asian Americans, Arab Americans, there's not a nation to point to aside from the one we live in. But there should be rights to full equality, access to jobs, housing, healthcare, freedom of religion, language. Black folks who live outside of the nation, Chicano folks who live outside of the nation, the right to full equality, freedom for deportations if you're an immigrant, immigrants of all stripes. And it's a question given special weight for Chicanos in the Southwest who get treated as if they're immigrants. They get deported oftentimes, despite a lot of them having many generations of living within the U.S. borders. They often say, the border crossed us, right? And that's a reality for them too. We say independence for the colonies that the U.S. still has, like Puerto Rico, Guam, the Marshall Islands. We don't say self-determination in the case of Puerto Rico, for instance, because them coming into the U.S., even if they vote for it via referendum, which can happen, is not on the table, right? Puerto Rican revolutionaries have fought for the right to say independence, and that's the demand that we prop up as well. And we say there should be the right to national development and sovereignty for American Indians, whose peoples were decimated by U.S. imperialism and national oppression, and are even seeing pipelines built across their land. So whether it's a casino or drilling the oil under their land for money, like the Osage, or the return of a park or a holy site, there should be protections and economic development. Racism is not a trick to divide the working class, in our view, right? It can divide the working class, and it does when it's used, but it only works because the inequality is material and real. And even outside of the nation, national oppression, it's what Harry Haywood, whose books we read, he was an important Black American revolutionary who wrote Negro Liberation, he called it the shadow of the plantation. It exists and it bears strength because it is connected to the national oppression of the nations. And it's not the workers in the U.S. who benefit, it's Wall Street and Wall Street only, our shared enemy against whom we need to unite and get rid of. And then finally, I'll talk about a Black liberation movement a bit specifically. It's undeniable to us that when the Northern capitalists betrayed Black Reconstruction, and they, allowed the South to go ahead and institute Black codes and Jim Crow, this led to the forging of a Black nation, right? It couldn't be assimilated into the U.S. because they were going to deliberately repress it. A nation was formed, despite people originally coming from the African continent speaking different languages, eating different foods. They were forged into a common people through struggle and national oppression, and have since not stopped fighting to be free. right? Being denied political power, locked out of economic opportunities, forced to go to poorer schools. Those things affect all who live there. The Black Belt South has right to work states all across, and that impacts everyone who lives there as well. But it's definitely the deepest felt and the most affected for, Black Americans. The police enforce this status quo at the point of a gun, and they kill discriminately, not indiscriminately, right? So Malcolm X's words still ring true to this day. I've heard criticisms from other left organizations I'm not going to focus on, of our line on the national question, right? They say things like, Black people are only 14% of the population. How can they possibly be a nation? But, W.E.B. Du Bois, actually, who was the creator of the NAACP, he went on to say, the population of the Black South is more populous than Belgium. So it's kind of undeniable. The nation is there. What about people moving out of the nation, to other states, maybe when they got more money, or if the laws changed or something? Isn't it everywhere? Well, Amiri Baraka said in his essay, to say it's everywhere is the same as saying that it's nowhere. And people, more Irish people live outside of Ireland now, but people don't dispute the fact that Ireland exists and is a homeland of those people. Or it was. The Black national movement speaks for itself. All of its accomplishments, everything from the intellectuals of the Harlem Renaissance to the George Floyd uprising here in Minneapolis that sparked the international rebellion, it speaks for itself. It's been a historical tide that's lifted all boats. Day to day, for a lot of our comrades who are in the work, it looks like fighting against the injustice of police crimes, fighting for those families, for community control of the police. So you can have revolutions and national movements that are not socialist in character, and that's something that actually as communists we need to build, is we need to build those national movements. More than that, what we as revolutionaries can bring is saying that it's actually the working class that can really lead those national movements to victory in the smoothest path possible, the destruction of exploitation and underdevelopment. And there's a great book written by our comrade Frank Chapman about the origins of the Black liberation movement and how it had an independent origin but had a deep compatibility with the communist movement in the U.S., who fought actively, against the laws of Jim Crow and, lynching and things like that. So we in the U.S. as revolutionaries must devote our attention to the national question. We must support the Black liberation movement, all forms that we can, actively work to build it. The oppressed peoples of the U.S. are clamoring to be free, and we should remember Assata Shakur, who died last year, Black revolutionary, and she actually invoked Marx in saying, unite, we have nothing to lose but our chains, here speaking to the workers and oppressed peoples of the world. And I think this is the way we as Marxist-Leninists should remember Black History Month. So, thank you.
Thank you, Chrisley. Before we introduce our next speaker, I forgot to introduce myself. But my name is Sasmit Rahman. I am a longtime member of SDS and a proud member of Freedom Road Socialist Organization. I want to keep this brief just because I can't wait to hear what our panelists have to say. I did want to mention I entered student organizing in 2020 following the George Floyd uprising, and I think as so many of my peers did, and that really just goes to show the struggle for Black liberation and the struggle against police crimes, racist retaliation, the struggle for oppressed nationalities is something that really brings people into the movement and radicalizes young people, and which is why it is so important to be continuously talking about. With that, I want to introduce our next speaker, Jae Yates. They are a leader of the National Alliance Against Political Repression, as well as a leader in our affiliate chapter, Twin Cities Coalition for Justice.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for that introduction. Since everyone is sort of starting by sharing how they sort of got into movement work, I'll just briefly say that I moved here from Iowa, where there was not really a lot in terms of organizing opportunities. But actually, that was the place where I was first radicalized because I went to college, got away from sort of my conservative family, and started learning really in depth about history. And that knowledge is really the first thing that made me start thinking, wow, this system that we live under is completely fucked up and is based entirely on exploitation and misery. And when I came here, one of my first protest experiences was after Philando Castile was murdered, when several groups, including the Black Lives Matter Twin Cities chapter, took a highway. And like that was like one of my first times like collectively experiencing police brutality, which was kind of wild, having experienced it as an individual. And it really solidified for me that like this is a fight that we all have to be in to get that boot off of our necks. I think that the thing that brought me to Marxism was also history. I think that the historical record truly speaks for itself, which is why I want to kind of talk about Black history today from a Marxist perspective. And I think that in some parts of the Black community, there's this idea that like communism, socialism, and Marxism are inventions of white people. But as Frank Chapman notes in Marxist-Leninist Perspectives on Black Liberation and Socialism, Marxism as a science is no more uniquely European, isolated from the high road of human civilization than mathematics, medicine, and chemistry. So to kind of get into a brief overview of Black American history, obviously Black history does not begin and end with slavery. It's undeniably, though, where the history of Black Americans begins. And so because my time is limited, I'm going to focus on that for this presentation. But you should definitely learn about other Black liberation struggles in other countries. The transatlantic slave trade refers to the period spanning roughly from the 15th through the 19th century in which Europeans forcibly trafficked at least 12 million Africans to the Americas and the Caribbean to cultivate cash crops like tobacco, sugar, and cotton. The Portuguese dominated the slave trade for over a century, followed by the Dutch in the 1600s. By the 18th century, the slave trade was run predominantly by French and British merchants with the full support of their governments. Most trafficked Africans were transported to the Caribbean, but in the 1800s, due to rising demand for tobacco and cotton, nearly 3/5 of the entire population of enslaved Africans would end up in America. There is kind of an attempt by our administration, and honestly, it's an attempt that predates the Trump administration, this tendency to minimize the true barbarity of the slave trade. But not only was the Middle Passage one of the primary ways that enslaved Africans died during the slave trade, it was characterized in its entirety by family separation, beatings, abuse, and rape. In the WPA archives, there are first-hand accounts of slaves recounting how slave owners used violence to control them and to minimize the possibility of revolt. And when you study sort of slave uprisings and how much people were risking to do that, and how much violence it took to overcome the violence that they were subjugated to, sort of the reality of the brutality is really clear. I would really encourage people to look those up and listen to them. They're in the Library of Congress. So there was also this concept that I want to talk about because it speaks to the labor relations of slavery called soundness. And soundness was a way that slave owners evaluated slaves that was directly related to how much they would cost to purchase. And your soundness was based on things like how many times you would run away. They would look at enslaved people's bodies for signs of the abuse that they endured, because typically slaves were abused as a form of punishment or to coerce them into labor. And so if you had a lot of whipping scars, for example, that would reduce the price that you would get at auction for that slave. Initially, in terms of population, New York had the highest population of slaves in the United States because it was a major port of entry in the early Americas. But through the late 18th and 19th centuries, the population quickly spread to what we now call the Black Belt, which is a region of the South where counties were predominantly populated by Black people. Virginia had the largest enslaved population with 490,865 people held in bondage. This is followed by Georgia with 462,198, Mississippi with 436,631, Alabama with 435,080, and South Carolina with 402,406 people. In these states, slavery shaped nearly every aspect of economic and political life, from land ownership patterns to representation in Congress. And the concentration of Black enslaved people isn't the reason that this is called the Black Belt, but it is why so many Black people are still concentrated there today, is that was the main region of America that enslaved people were exported to. As America developed, enslaved populations moved from sort of the northeast coast down into the Black Belt and even spread into the west as Manifest Destiny was happening. Briefly, I want to talk about sort of how enslaved people and native nations interacted. There are a few examples of this with the Seminoles. There is sort of this pervasive narrative about the Seminole tribes that they participated in slavery, which is true, but like overemphasized. Actually, a lot of times people who are sort of marginalized groups who are accused of this actually participated in slavery as a way of emancipating enslaved people. Because prior to the Emancipation Proclamation, that was one of the only ways that you could free a family member or a loved one. Many more Black people were adopted or married into tribal nations after being brought to America, which makes a lot of sense because a lot of these lands were inhabited by Native people, and now you had Black folks living in close proximity with them. And there was a lot of shared solidarity because of a shared reality of oppression. The proximity and this shared reality led to a lot of cultural exchange and solidarity. For example, many people of the Lumbee tribe, those are a tribal nation that is famous for beating up some Klans members and stealing their little outfits and flags in the 50s. There are a lot of really great pictures of that. And then there's the Gullah Geechee, which is it's a sort of unique subgroup of the Black population that was able to retain their unique African identities in a different way than many other African people because of the isolation where the Gullah Geechee reside. And then there's sort of, other examples later on in American history, like the solidarity between the Black Panthers and AIM. If I have time, I will go back to that. But I want to talk about sort of what are the criteria for a nation like Chrisley laid out, and how do Black people fit those in more specifics. So common language, one, African-American vernacular English arose from the need for enslaved Africans to communicate across different ethnic lines and different languages. Common territory, we've sort of already covered. Common economic life, obviously slavery, but later on in United States history, there's sharecropping, which was what a majority of ex-enslaved people ended up doing to survive, which was essentially slavery with extra steps. Disenfranchisement from housing and jobs also affected pretty much every Black person in America's economic life. Additionally, there's the Black Codes, which were a series of laws restricting Black people's ability to buy and lease land, own property, and participate in local government, among other things. What the black codes did was they actually primarily criminalized black people for moving through public space via restrictive vagrancy laws. And this gave law enforcement and civilian white people the pretext to harass black people for perceived infractions or disobedience and either enslave them, jail them, or kill them. And the black codes were also designed to punish black people financially for non-compliance with white supremacy. As one example, in South Carolina, black people who had jobs other than farm labor or servants, they were forced to pay an annual tax ranging from $10 to $100, which in our money today would be nearly $2,000. So not only was like the early prison system in the United States making a killing in terms of enslaving black people and being able to buy property in order to build jails and things like that, there was also an incredible amount of transfer of what little wealth black people did build in these annual taxes and through the black codes. And then there's the psychological makeup. Obviously, all of these conditions created a common experience for black people in the U.S. Personally, I don't know a single black person myself that can't trace their lineage back to enslavement. I don't know very many black people that haven't experienced police brutality. So these are all sort of common experiences that create the psychological commonalities between black people in the U.S. So the next thing I wanted to touch on was the slave trade and capitalism, because racial hierarchy is not sort of this like thing that arises because like people are evil or whatever. It has a function. It's a way of justifying super exploitation of certain groups of people. And as early as 1847, Karl Marx was explicitly saying how slavery was a requirement for capitalism, not merely a byproduct. He and Engels write in their anthology, The Civil War in the United States, the following: "Slavery is an economic strategy like any other. Without slavery, you have no cotton. Without cotton, you have no modern industry. It is slavery that has given value to the colonies. It is the colonies that created world trade. It is world trade that is the necessary condition for large-scale machine industry. Without slavery, North America, the most economically progressive of the countries, would be transformed into a patriarchal country. Cause slavery to disappear, and you will have wiped America off the map of nations." In other words, the amassment of capital that gave Western countries the ability to develop industry at the scale and pace that allowed them to dominate world markets would not have been possible without the barbarism of slavery. Later, in a contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, Marx argues that human society arises primarily from the labor relations that then form the base of our social relations, aka culture, which we also sometimes call superstructure. Base and superstructure reinforce and reproduce the other. And so it's our labor relations that form sort of how society develops and drives that forward. And this is where racism actually comes from. Like I said, it's not an individual prejudice or a happenstance. Racism was intentionally created to justify specific labor relations. So getting into Reconstruction, which is the period in U.S. history where formerly enslaved people were themselves attempting to create new lives for themselves, were attempting to integrate into American society, which white people just straight up did not like. For a little while, they kind of pretended to like it, like Northern white people after the Emancipation Proclamation had sort of a show of like, yeah, we totally want you to be part of America, but they very quickly abandoned Reconstruction. And, you know, at the beginning of Reconstruction, there were the Union troops stayed in the South to sort of squash attempts at Confederates to sort of retake their territory, to reinstitute the laws of slavery. But once that backing from northern states disappeared, it became harder and harder for people to resist things like the black codes being created. But resist they did. And one of the main reasons black people actually sought self-determinative power at this time was to protect themselves from the increasing power afforded to slave patrols and their gradual but dangerous formalization. So we're going to kind of get into the history of policing here for a moment, but for context, policing in colonial America had been very informal, based on a for-profit, privately funded system that employed people part-time. Towns also commonly relied on a night watch in which volunteers signed up for a certain day and time, mostly to look out for fellow colonists engaging in prostitution or gambling. The system wasn't very efficient because watchmen often fell asleep and drank on duty, very American of them. And people were also put on watch duty as a form of punishment, so it was like they're not going to do a good job. But with the creation of the transatlantic slave trade, the business of patrolling became suddenly much more lucrative, as plantation owners were willing to pay larger sums to recoup what they saw as lost investments when slaves would run away. Dr. Gary Potter, who's a crime historian, states the following, which is slave patrols had three primary functions. One, to chase down, apprehend, and return to their owners runaway slaves, and two, to provide a form of organized terror to deter slave revolts, and three, to maintain a form of discipline for slave workers who were subject to summary justice outside of the law if they violated any plantation rules. The first publicly funded organized police force with officers on duty full-time was created in Boston in 1838 because Boston was a large shipping and commercial center. So the very origin of police in this country was to keep black people enslaved and or controlled, and also to protect property. Following the Civil War, hundreds of thousands of former enslaved black people and Union soldiers were sort of wandering in search of work, which is where you get the black codes. White people were extremely afraid of the threat of black integration, and the General Assembly created the vagrancy laws of 1866. When a so-called vagrant was caught, they were sentenced to hard unpaid labor for up to 3 months, with additional terms of forced labor if the person was recaptured. If you're thinking that this sounds pretty similar to how American jails currently work, it should, because we actually still essentially do things like convict leasing, which was a common practice to also continue the free labor of slavery even after it was abolished. In the late 19th century, fears of labor union organizers and of large waves of Catholic, Irish, Italian, German, and Eastern European immigrants drove the call for the preservation of law and order. The first publicly funded organized... Oh, sorry, I already read that. It's my bad. And at the same time, formal political power was being consolidated in major cities, so police captains and sergeants for each precinct were often picked by the local political party, which shaped how the law was enforced, specifically in regard to black people. And in the 1930s, problems enforcing prohibition led President Hoover to try to professionalize the police force. And despite making up just 13% of the U.S. population, black people now account for more than 50% of those incarcerated. And innocent black people are wrongfully convicted at higher rates across all major crime categories except for white-collar crime. For murder, it's 7.5 times the rate of whites, for rape, 8.5, and for drug crimes, a whopping 19 times the rate of conviction compared to white people. I think that this is an important backdrop for understanding what activists during the Civil Rights era were fighting against. And white politicians in both parties during this period demonized communities of color, especially black communities, under the pretense of fighting rising crime. In reality, this was a lie to quell the Black Liberation Movement and the anti-war movement. And John Ehrlichman, who was Nixon's domestic policy chief, which Nixon is the architect of the war on drugs, He admitted in 1994 saying, "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." And so this is sort of where you get the system of mass incarceration, which, as one organization fighting against mass incarceration puts it, it's an expensive way to achieve less public safety. It costs taxpayers $87 billion annually for roughly the same level of public safety achieved in 1978 for $5.5 billion. My apologies. And so, like, for me, I think that this really answers the question of self-determination for the Black nation, and why we fight for that, and why we fight for full equality and political power for everyone living everywhere else. Community control of the police is an example of something that fulfills both of these things. In 1973, the Black Panthers, Bobby Seale put it this way: there, the police's real power is manifested in the organized guns and force. But we're saying that the people in this community, the people in this country, don't have any control over that organized guns and force. We're saying that the capitalists, the racists, and others have control over it. And we're saying that we want to change it, that we want to revolutionize it and turn it over into the hands of the people for a new process to occur. We're saying we want community control. And in the spirit of this quote, like, this was a multinational movement, both at the time that it was created, and it's a multinational movement now. It's not that Black revolutionaries wanted only Black people to be free from the yoke of police brutality. It was that they wanted to end police brutality. But as illustrated by this quote, community control isn't an alternative to abolition or defunding the police, but it's a requirement for any sort of process in changing the police and the structure of how the oppression of Black people is enforced. You have to have control over that process. As Pan-African Community Action puts it, the fight for community control over police has the potential to remove us from the indignity of having to manage the public relations aspects of colonial occupation. A community police control board holds the potential to not only shift power into the hands of the Black community, but to transform the very definition of power. Once we are able to secure community control over police and ensure that entire communities are empowered to exercise such control, we will be free to reimagine and re-envision the very nature of policing itself. And so that's sort of why in Black liberation movements, that's something that TCC for Jae is working to achieve. It's not that we want to work with the pigs, but that we believe that they need to be leashed in order for us to do anything about the brutality that our communities experience. I just sort of want to end by saying that Black liberation struggles are not and never have been antithetical to the socialist movement. And I think that in reading Black revolutionaries like W.E.B. Du Bois and also later thinkers like even Malcolm X, who didn't consider himself a socialist, but absolutely his ideas were compatible with socialism. I think that the idea that socialism is for white people or that it's this European construct ignores the historical reality of the parallels between these movements. And so in Freedom Road, it's incredibly important for us to unite with Black liberation struggles wherever possible. It's why we prioritize working with families who are impacted by police brutality, and it's why we work to free people who are wrongfully incarcerated, because those are both things that ultimately liberate not only Black people, but all other oppressed nationalities in the U.S. I think you said it earlier. It's a tide that lifts all boats, which I don't remember who actually quoted that. But it's liberation struggle that really lifts up all others and that we all can learn from. So.
Thank you, Jae. Just something about the Gullah Geechee shout out. You know, it's getting warmer. It's springtime. It's actually springtime for building a revolutionary movement in this country too. People are coming to us from all walks of life, and just not like not even a year ago, more like 6 months ago, we recruited a new district of our organization in the Low Country in South Carolina, who are building work amongst Gullah Geechee people, and are recognizing, you know, that the Gullah Geechee are, it's really like, you know, you could call it the heartland of the Black Belt South, because this was the first place where you had these people from all different African nations coming, you know, and together forming a new culture, a new nation in the Black Belt. So, yeah, thank you. All right, awesome. Next, we're going to hear from another heavy hitter. We have Mira, and I asked how do they want to be introduced, and they said a pretty cool guy. So whatever that means. No, I'm just pretty cool. But yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Syd, for telling everybody my business. To give an actual introduction of myself, hi everyone. My name is Mira Altobell-Resendez. I use they, them pronouns. I am a very, very proud member of Freedom Road Socialist Organization, and I am an organizer in the Minnesota Immigrant Rights Action Committee. Thank you. I love Mirek. But just to give like a little bit of background about how I got into this work as well, is that the first protest that I ever attended was one that was demanding that the charges be dropped for the 646 protesters who were unlawfully arrested on I-94 on election night in 2020, demanding justice for George Floyd and justice for all lives that were stolen by police, no matter who was in office. And those charges did mostly get dropped in the end, and so that's super cool. And then from there, I ended up joining SDS at the same time as Sasmit did, while we had a campaign going to win community control of the police on campus, adopting that from the citywide fight for it that is still ongoing. And the reason that I really have stuck with Freedom Road for so long, aside from all of the great work that our comrades do, is that being involved in this revolutionary organization was the first time I really understood like my own nationhood and like the history of my nationality. Because even as a Chicano who went to Spanish immersion school from kindergarten through 12th grade, I never actually learned the history of my people and where my family came from. And so I want to start off by giving a brief historical overview of what it means to be Chicano, and where that nation came from in the world. So that started back when Mexico had just won its independence from Spain, and it was already being subjugated by the U.S. In 1821, the year that Mexico won its independence war against Spain, there was already a large portion of what we now know as Texas that was illegally overtaken by white settlers. And in the following decade, in 1830, when Mexico abolished slavery, over 3 decades before the United States did, I will add, those white settlers who owned slaves themselves were feeling very threatened, and so they waged their own battle on Mexico that was backed by the U.S. government. Those settlers won their own independence. If you've ever heard of like when Texas had their own independence in 1836, that's why it happened, because they loved owning slaves so much, and they seized that land from Mexico in the process. And these weren't the only white settlers that were on the soil that was Mexico at the time. There was also in Utah, Brigham Young and his Mormon followers settled in what is now known as Utah, but was then also Mexico in 1847. The year after that, the U.S. had cornered Mexico in the Mexican-American War, sort of had to coerce them into signing the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. That was on February 2nd, 1848, so we just recently passed that anniversary. And they forced Mexico to cede a huge portion of land to them, which eventually became what we know as 9 of the Southwest states in the US, and that is all of California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, as well as parts of Texas, Wyoming, and Kansas. So that is, like, if you think about it, just a huge portion of land that the US decided to take. And this is exactly why we say, no nos cruzamos la frontera nos cruzó. Or in English, we didn't cross the border crossed us. Because this meant that all of these people who already existed on this land, the native people, the newly established Mexican people who had just beaten Spain out of that territory, were suddenly immigrants, and they didn't even do anything or move anywhere. And so that created an entire displaced people who now had to figure out what their identity was and what their relation was to the rest of the U.S. And this didn't happen peacefully by any means. The U.S. overtook the land brutally. It's the only way the U.S. knows how to do things. They killed and enslaved the native people who the land had rightfully belonged to in the first place, as well as the more recently established Mexican people. They banned the people who were already on that land from mining independently. They segregated children in the schools. They suppressed the languages and forced the native people and the millions of people who were now immigrants and people who later immigrated from, like, the new Mexican border to work as laborers in what were now American mines, fields, and factories in the southwest U.S. This portion of the land was named Aztlán, or Aztec land, at the 1969 National Chicano Youth Liberation Conference. I was attended by over 1,500 working-class Chicanos, including prominent labor leaders like Corky Gonzalez. And since then, it's been a long time, obviously, but Chicanos are still a people. We have developed a distinct culture within the Aztlán territory that has made its way to the rest of the U.S. in smaller pockets. A lot of Chicanos who moved away from Aztlán found their way to the Midwest, in Chicago and in the Twin Cities and things like that. And we continue to develop in our own way, just like we can see in the West Side neighborhood of St. Paul right here in Minnesota, which is actually where my dad grew up. So I'm going to get into some of the demands that Freedom Road sees as the immediate demands of the Chicano Latino people, whether we are immigrant or non-immigrant in or outside of Aztlán, and I'm going to give, like, a little bit of an explanation of what those demands really mean as well. First of all, this, like, really overarching one is legalization for all. Yes, we love legalization for all. And that's because we have to recognize that our immigration system relies on criminalizing certain people's existence. If you don't follow the quote-unquote legal or correct way that can take up to decades to enter the U.S., you are automatically a criminal that the U.S. government is seeking to punish. There are some other common demands that we hear, like comprehensive immigration reform and abolish ICE, but we know that those will never be enough as long as human beings can be classified as illegal simply for existing. And so as long as the power lies in the hands of capitalists, they will keep recreating the same systems under different names to continue that racist exploitation. The next demand is an end to all immigration raids and deportations. This is something that hits especially close to home for us here in Minnesota right now, because we have all come face to face with the violent tactics that ICE and DHS deploy to carry out deportations and to keep immigrant supporters at bay. But that violence doesn't end with the actual capture that happens in the streets. I want to take a moment to remember Victor Manuel Diaz. He's a man who died in ICE custody after being kidnapped from Minneapolis the week that Renee Good was murdered. ICE detainees are subject to completely unchecked physical and sexual abuse and neglect of their basic human needs. And then returning to the countries that they came from is often dangerous. You know, they left for a reason, and a lot of times it's because the U.S. was meddling in their government or waging some sort of war for oil or something like that. Or we've also seen a lot of immigrants who are deported not even be sent back to their home countries where they would at least be familiar with the conditions there, but sent to a different country entirely that they've never been to. Next is an end to border militarization. There are walls that are built higher and higher with barbed wire. The U.S. uses Israeli surveillance equipment and techniques at the border to track when people try to cross it. Yeah, fuck Israel. And Chicano communities near the border are constantly occupied by Border Patrol with military-grade weapons. MIREC is part of the Legalization for All network, and we have sort of a sister organization down in Eagle Pass, Texas, that is right by El Rio Grande. And they, all the time, because of these buoys and these pretty much traps that are set in the river for people who are trying to cross the border, part of their political organizing that they do day to day is recovering the bodies of people who did not survive crossing the river into the U.S. and helping to identify them and trying to get them back to their families. Speaking of families, we also want to prioritize the family reunification for loved ones who are separated by the U.S.-Mexico border. My own family was separated by the southwest border. My great uncle tells me about how when he was a child in Texas, before the border was as militarized as it is now, he would walk across the river on a bridge to go play with his cousins in Mexico between Laredo and Nuevo Laredo. But this is something that's unimaginable now. And conditions for immigrants are so poor in the U.S. that the way a lot of families end up in the U.S., if they're trying to all end up in the United States, is that one or two members of a family will immigrate at a time, not knowing how long it'll take to reunite in the U.S., where they're supposed to be living better than in their home countries, but some never see their families again. We want a full equality of languages. There are still tons of racist English-only practices. Like, just look at the whole hubbub about the Super Bowl halftime show. Even like the president of our country needed his own special halftime show that was in English because he doesn't know good music, I guess. Yeah, but on a more serious note, bilingual schools and daycares are constantly targeted by conservatives who seek to erase Chicano and Latino and other oppressed nationality cultures. And there are legal proceedings that only happen in English without translation services, and those often result in non-English speaking people being tricked into signing documents to waive their own rights, and that is absolutely on purpose. Finally, we demand no guest worker programs and an end to worker exploitation. The Bracero program in the middle of the 20th century took advantage of Mexican labor, promised all of these wages and these benefits and completely cheated these people out of them, but was ended by the civil rights movement. And the civil rights movement is what ended it, because guest worker programs pretty much create a second class of people, oppressed nationality people who are usually Chicano and Latino in our history. And they are just completely lied to about what they'll gain from their labor and are stolen from. And on top of that, it undermines the existing labor movement due to the competition of having an option to hire these workers who have no protections at all and have been completely lied to and are being told to work for dirt. Of course, nobody's going to hire the union workers who actually have a legal standard for how they're treated and how they're paid, you know? And so all this to say, Chicanos, African Americans, Native peoples, and all other oppressed nationalities that exist within the U.S. have always had a common enemy, and that is U.S. imperialism. And that is a point of unity and solidarity that capitalists fear, because oppressed peoples become more powerful when we see the through lines of our subjugation and fight it together, side by side. And so I want to highlight some historical and current points of solidarity between the Chicano movement and the Black Liberation movement. And something that that Chicanos hold in really high regard is the Black Panther Party and their 10-point program. These were inspirations, and the Black Panthers were allies to the Chicano movement during the era of the 60s and 70s, especially between the Brown Berets in LA and the Black Panther Party collaborating on several occasions. And there's particularly a lot of unity on combating police brutality and political repression. The work of the Black Panthers and other figures from that time of the Black liberation movement should be credited for inspiring the militancy of the Chicano movement in Aztlán in that era. I'm going to list like a few examples of this, but I do want to point out that all of these things that I'm about to list happened in Los Angeles, where the Chicano movement continues to be super, super strong and is partially under the leadership of some Freedom Road comrades, namely Carlos Montes, who was a member of the LA Brown Berets himself, as well as Sol Marquez, who is a terrific activist, and she has a great piece called My Journey to Aztlán that was very formative for myself as a socialist, that I believe we have copies of at the back table, perhaps. But first of all, in 1968, there were student walkouts in East LA over the inequality in public education, and those were responded to by sheriff's deputies showing up in full riot gear and resulted in the arrest of 13 Chicano student leaders. But they eventually got their trumped up charges dropped because of the multinational struggle against that political repression. Later on, in 1970, there was the Chicano Moratorium. It was a series of peaceful demonstrations against the Vietnam War because a disproportionate number of Mexican Americans and Chicanos were wounded and killed in a war that they didn't even want to fight in the first place. And this was again met with police violence, which resulted in many injuries, over 150 arrests, and 4 killings by law enforcement. Then later on, during the Rodney King riots in 1992, Chicanos and Latinos fought against the California National Guard and other federal law enforcement alongside Black freedom fighters, and they made up a third of those killed by the violence of those officers. It's a great shame. So our struggles are obviously still connected today. In Minneapolis, Chicanos are fighting for a sanctuary policy to protect our loved ones from racial profiling and discrimination that's happening all the time. But those sanctuary policies, the separation ordinances to keep the local law enforcement from working with ICE and federal immigration forces, they mean nothing if it's not enforceable. And the only way to make it enforceable is by winning community control of the police, which Black people have been fighting for decades, and we stand with them 10 toes down. We also share the ongoing battle against racial inequality in schools, housing, and healthcare. And we fight to win all that can be won under the current system. And ultimately, we cannot have Chicano liberation without Black liberation. And the only way to win all of our liberation is to synthesize the struggles of all nationally oppressed and working people against capitalism. So until the day comes where the U.S. imperialism is defeated and we have full rights, equality, and dignity for all, la lucha sigue.
Thank you, Mira. All right, let's give it up for all the panelists. Amazing, amazing. Hell yeah. Yeah, you know, I just want to pull out that piece. What's the basis for unity, right? Because some people say, you know, you'll hear it's all the same struggle, it's all the same. It's actually not. It's not all the same struggle. We have different groups of people, different histories. That's why we have different demands, because there's different conditions, right? But the basis for unity is that we have the same enemy. We have the same enemy, and you know, people don't automatically understand who the enemy is either. So that's the job of revolutionaries, to be of these movements and in these movements and point to who the enemy really is. Yeah. So I think we're gonna do a little Q&A. Yeah. All right.
Does anyone have any questions? Okay. Let's see. Can we pass the mic around, or do we want to have people come up? Okay.
Well, my question is...
Or you could just project.
My question is, what do you guys think when you hear someone from your own background say, well, that's not our fight? What do you guys have to say about that?
Thank you.
Yeah, I can start it off. I mean, one, like, I personally find the sort of what I've been calling like the online psyop of like Black people saying shit like, yeah, I'm just like sitting back from this one, like this doesn't have anything to do with Black people. I think it's ridiculous because, one, that's demonstrably untrue. If you look at the way that ICE is behaving, the reason that they're empowered to do these things is because of the legacy of police brutality. It's the exact same playbook that has been used to criminalize Black communities is now being used on immigrants. And actually saying now is even not quite accurate because like policing has always been a function of subjugation for oppressed nationalities in the United States. And so to suggest that at any point that we're watching one oppressed nation be brutalized, that we should step out of the fight is absurd, and actually weakens our ability to not only unite with different liberation movements for and strengthen our movements in that way, but it also, motivates, I think, our own movement. I think that it gives people an excuse to stop engaging with the political reality in which they live. And so all of these fights are fights because we're all living on the same rock. We're all here at the same time. And if we don't destroy capitalism, we're all doomed. And so, I think that this idea that there's ever a point in which, especially somebody who considers themselves an activist in any respect, should be saying, this isn't my business. Like, that's ridiculous.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and we actually have a word for this. We call it narrow nationalism. It's our nationality that we're concerned with and not others. And actually, we have a method for dealing with this too, that who's best equipped to handle things, and it's the oppressed nationality revolutionaries in and of the movement, that we know how to talk to our people more than somebody outside of it, right? And so it's part of our responsibility to combat against narrow nationalism in that way, pointing out that, like we said, we have the same enemy. The same one that's stepping on them is going to step on us next time, right? Yeah. Great question. Any others? The speakers were just so thorough that we answered every question under the sun. We also told you where to read more too, right? Black Liberation and Marxist Leninist Perspectives on Black Liberation and Socialism by Frank Chapman. It's an amazing book. Mira hit on some points in our program where we outline this strategy for revolution. We're revolutionaries, but we also actually have a plan. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
So I've been seeing a lot, mostly online, about the Black Native Americans in Louisiana, the Seminoles. I mean, when you just mentioned that just now, I've just been hearing just, where can I go and find the actual truth behind that, Because, I mean, it's just like, I don't know if it's more so colorism, but you get what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, are you kind of talking about are you sort of talking about the online myth of actually African Americans are the original Native people? Yeah. I mean, first of all, that's just not history. It's they're just wrong factually. African Americans came to the United States via slavery. That's just true. I think that a lot of Black people dislike the way that enslavement has been made a central part of Black history, but unfortunately that is reality. I think at the same time, sort of to your point about colorism, I think that because of anti-Black racism, some Native people are also similarly uncomfortable with the proximity of Black history to their own history. And so I think that the solution to that is accuracy. The solution to that is actually looking at historical documents to unravel like the shared history that these two groups of people have. To talk about the Seminoles in particular, the Seminoles, throughout histories of slave rebellions, like they were in that. They often sheltered free black people, which is how some black people came to be part of the Seminole tribe. Like I was saying earlier, like the Lumbee, most of the Lumbee are mixed race. Like they are both black and indigenous. And so like this idea, again, that like these histories can be separated simply isn't an accurate reading. And I think that the more that we as organizers and revolutionaries can educate our people about their history, the more consolidated they are around our shared goals with these different groups of people that have, like Syd was saying, a common enemy with the black struggle, just as indigenous people also have a stake in overthrowing capitalism.
Okay. One of your guys is, and this is coming from a black woman myself. What do you think stops the when it's a black person being gunned down? Why is there more of a urge for wanting to do something when it's a white person or somebody else being gunned
I mean, I feel like we see this a bit with Renee Good and Alex Preddy being murdered by law enforcement in Minneapolis. Those names are far more recognized than the names of black people who have been shot down by law enforcement over the past few years in like such a regular pattern, and everybody should know those names, you know? And like we see that I guess sort of hypocrisy even in our elected officials, like Jacob Fry. He didn't care about ICE being in Minneapolis until a white woman was killed. That's what it took for him to say fuck ICE. And that is that like it doesn't matter until it happens to someone who looks like me is something that the people who are in power right now thrive upon, because they don't want us to see ourselves in each other and to have that solidarity with each other. And so from when we are super, super young, we are constantly taught, like, only look out for people who look like yourself. And that is that at work.
Yeah, I think that's part of it too. I do want to say one thing though, which is that, you know, there's ebbs and flows in the movement, and actually, you know, each wave of mass struggle, we're beginning from a higher level than the last wave. And, you know, in the when I talked about the first wave of Black Lives Matter, I remember, you know, it was, and these were huge demonstrations. It was only black people pretty much there. 2020 was different. 2020 was different. In Dallas, it was way different where I was, and I know it was different in Minneapolis too. This was what was so different, was you had people from so many different nationalities who actually came out and marched for George Floyd. And I just think that that's a testament to how things develop, the consciousness develops, you know, in each wave. And that's part of our job too, is to bring things to a higher level and talk to our people. That's white revolutionaries' job too, to, you know, combat white chauvinism amongst their people and point out the problems with all of that, right? So we all have work for us to do, right? We all have work for us to do. Yeah.
And if I could just say super quick, like, I think that, you know, the way of dealing with people who are coming to the movement who are, you know, not with it in the same way that people that have already been in it, I think it's important, sort of to your point, for us to remember where we started, and have patience and humility with people, because the reality is that we are one of the most propagandized populations on Earth. What we're fighting against is decades upon decades upon decades of indoctrination, and like you were saying, like an intentional project to dehumanize black people in particular, and also dehumanize by way of that other groups. And so it's sort of like I was saying about a tide that lifts all boats. When black people's lives are seen as valuable, I think that does have a measurable effect on how other groups of people are viewed by white communities and by other nationalities that maybe historically didn't see that solidarity. And that's really why we have things like, Say Her Name, is because black women are not often elevated to the same status that like white victims are. And so like those kinds of things are important as tools to educate people about the inequalities between how these things that affect different nationalities are perceived in our society. But we shouldn't be like, bashing on people. We should be trying to educate them and trying to unite with them as much as we can.
Was there another question? Yeah. Sure. Okay. One more thing when you said, because I've seen this too, our history, we're not actually descended from slaves, we're actually native, this type of thing. It's a part of the national oppression that black people have faced here, that our history is buried. So people just be making shit up sometimes too. And that's okay. It's not good, but part of what we have to do is to uplift and advance the national consciousness in our movement, that actually we as a people have a specific path that brought us here. We have a specific struggle. We have a specific, culture that we should be proud of. That's us. We don't have to make things up. It's real. And it's a nation,
And I don't mean to try to compare each other's traumas like I've mentioned several times before. It's just so goddamn difficult to be, because every race done shitted on black people. You know what I'm saying? And still to this day, it's still continuously happening. But I just want to hope that everyone that's not black in this room, and obviously that are black, please educate your people, because it is extremely fucking difficult getting this shit rolling.
Yep. That goes for other oppressed nationalities too. People know how to talk to their own people, right? And people who do have that more advanced consciousnness, we have to, take things head on, and struggle over it.
Because I be getting into it, my black people.
Yes. It's honest work. Awesome.
Is that a question in the back?
So I think racism is absolutely a tool of national oppression, and I think that might be a way to, a lot of people come to this politics first by just understanding racism, because that's going to be what's in our books and what is in the history and what has been determined by our enemy that we can learn. And it's actually really good that we get to learn about it, but it is one of the tools of national oppression, right? And then I think that Jae mentioned the superstructure earlier. It's the ideas and everything that come out of kind of the material base of capitalism that upholds that status quo and reinforce it. And racism is that tool, the idea that, some races are better than others, and, the world is as it should be, and, the hardworking people got where they are, and we need to actively, fight racism, but we need to go further too and say, look, like there's a reason that these ideas exist, and those liars are, they're lying for a particular reason. So, and I think in his book, ML Perspectives on Black Liberation and Socialism, Frank does a really good job saying, let's take the people who are fighting against racism because they are the people that we want, and then let's, take them further and talk about, and here's why, these myths exist, and why, we've been sold this horrible lie, and why these institutions are built around it.
Yeah, and it also, I think that's a great answer, and it also is important to get this, because then what are we fighting about? If everything is racism, if everything is people's ideas, that this group of people doesn't like black people, well, I actually don't give a damn what you think, right? But there's, in real life, black people are oppressed. That's national oppression. It's not just something that's in people's heads. And if we think that it's something that's in people's heads, that's individuals, feelings towards each other, then we're going to spend all of our energy on trying to change people's minds, right? When we know we actually have to get full equality. Nations actually need liberation, not just changing people's minds. Changing people's minds happens along the way, actually. We want to change the structure of society. So we want power, not just people to be nicer to each other. So actually, who was it that said this? But, in the civil rights movement, integration of schools, right? So a lot of white people were super racist, of course, and they swore up and down, if schools integrate, I will absolutely never send my child to school. It's not happening, right? They changed the laws and these people sent their kids to schools, and here we are. Don't wait. If you get into people's ideas, you're going to waste your time. Because ideas come from somewhere, right? So let's change it somewhere in real life. Yeah.
Yeah, so precisely what we mean by that are the owners of the businesses, right? So it means the production, but the big businesses, especially like the finance sector, so the banks and whatnot, who have gone international, right? So the Rockefeller family has gone international. The DuPont family has gone international. It's not even like, just the company that they own, because they actually own multiple companies. That's how rich they are. It's so hard to conceive of how rich they are. But one way to think about it is who sits on Wall Street, who decides what companies thrive and survive, because they are the ones who decide the interest rates. There is actually a group of people who are so rich that they can determine that. They can determine what goes in our textbooks. They determine who wins the presidency in this or that country. They determine, what can come in and replace the black codes, Jim Crow. They're that powerful, right? So, and it's hard to conceive about, but it's real, and it's a super small group of people who own all the, 90+% of all the wealth in the world.
Yeah, the other part of that, not only has, at this point in the world, has, the entire, pretty much, Earth been split up to be shared among just, a few different companies and, corporations, but we feel the effects of it at home, too, which is why I think it's so important, and why we all mentioned imperialism when we were talking about nationhood within the U.S., because when the U.S. government is spending all of our resources, all of our money and everything on wars and on rigging elections and on instilling dictators in other countries for the U.S. government's interests, it's not the people of the United States. It's not the everyday working oppressed people who benefit from this. We are the ones who are paying the taxes that are going towards bombs and shit overseas. We're the ones who are sorry, I lost my train of thought. We're the ones who are suffering because we are sent to fight in wars that we don't agree with. That was the entire point of the protest that led to the Chicano moratorium, was that with the draft, or how people are coerced and to be conscripted into the military with promises of paying for your education, like you won't have to worry about money ever again. If you sell your body to this machine of U.S. imperialism, we are all suffering under that, and that is another part of national oppression.
Yeah, and just to add, there's been some, debate in online spaces about sort of the term imperial boomerang. And like what I want to say is that in order for a boomerang to come back, you have to throw it first. Like the reason that we call it a boomerang is that yes, these policies originate here. Oftentimes they are tested on the nationally oppressed in the United States and then exported, or vice versa, that the same brutality that we visit on other countries is then returned to us. It's a cycle, and it's really critical that people understand it as one, because otherwise you're going to fight these things in isolation. But the reason why Palestinians had solidarity with black communities during George Floyd is not only because they were seeing in real time parallels between these two struggles, but literally the same chokehold that was used to murder George Floyd was taught to the MPD by the IOF. And so to suggest that there's fighting police brutality and then there's fighting imperialism as though they aren't directly connected to each other, and as though the tactics that the United States imperial project uses abroad aren't also used to subjugate their own citizens to exploit and extract super profits from them, again, makes no sense if you're paying attention to anything happening around you. And so the common denominator is still imperialism when we're talking about fighting police brutality and when we're talking about fighting war abroad.
Yeah, I totally agree. I didn't learn any of this stuff. I feel like I learned the opposite, right? And I feel like we have learned so much of this through our own practice, and I feel like I've learned so much from being in the movement. So now I've learned, okay, if I want to know about what the Black Power movement was actually like, I'll read the stuff written by the Black Panthers themselves. And because of the internet, you can actually look it up. Or if I want to know what Corky Gonzalez thought, I'm not going to read a book about Corky Gonzalez. I'm going to look up what he said in his speeches. And, that stuff actually exists, and it is buried, right? Like someone said earlier. So we have to kind of bring it back up, and I think the movement does a good job of that. I know that in college they taught secondary sources are superior to primary sources because primary sources are biased. This whole thing is biased. That's one of the, okay, I don't want to, yeah, exactly. No. So we should learn from the people who did it. We should learn from revolutionaries. What do revolutionaries have to say about why they became the way that they are, right? And it's the same as us learning from our practice, but it's the people who came before. Right?
Yeah. Oh yeah, just to say, the ruling class is the ones that wrote all those history books, so they of course want us to know what they want us to know. In terms of, oh well, this is biased. You damn straight we're biased. We're biased on the side of liberation. We're biased on the side of the working class movement. So we're gonna stay biased because we have an aim, which is to get rid of this shit. So yeah.
Yeah, and I just to speak to your point a little more like directly. I mean, this is why Black people fought for history about enslavement to be not only included in school curriculums but to be accurate. The whole reason that I even wanted to become like a historian was because Black people understand on a fundamental level that our history is erased on purpose, because if people actually understood the reality of slavery, if they actually fully comprehended what a evil and exploitative project that really was, and that it's the whole basis for the United States' existence, a lot more people would be like not cool with the United States government. And so, like, of course, like Syd is saying, of course, white people worked very hard to keep slavery out of school curriculums. I mean, like, when I was going to school in Florida, yes, I am a product of both the Florida and the Iowa school systems. Which is pretty, yeah, look at me now. Yeah, like when I was going to school in Florida, there was literally a section in my textbook where they were talking about, like, some people talk about the slave trade as though it was this really bad thing. And, like, sure, people died on the Middle Passage, but, like, overall, like, white people treated their slaves really well. I mean, like, think about livestock. Like, you wouldn't mistreat your cow if you're, like, trying to, like, shit like that. And, like, the way that this is put into our schools is intentional, and I think that that's why we as people in the movement have to work to create events like this where we can educate our communities on actual history, and actually pull up primary sources, which are much more reliable than secondary, to like illustrate the reality of the inequalities that people are facing, so that we can actually fight them. Because if you have an incorrect view of history, you're going to draw incorrect conclusions about how to fight the problem that you're even talking about.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna do this very quick and then pass it to the comrade to tell us about some important things going on. But who here's been to church? Oh my gosh, everybody's been to church. Yeah, so I grew up in church, and to be fair, the Black church is actually the first place where I learned about the civil rights movement, right? So hell yeah. But there's a thing called the benediction, and at the end, we call people to join. Guys, guys, I'm doing an altar call right now. You know us, you've seen us, but just to say, when we're throwing around this term Marxism, Leninism, this is the body of theory and practice that captures the lessons of revolution. The lessons of revolution across the whole world, and in particular, the lessons from this last century of imperialism, and that's the era that we're in, right? So we're standing on the shoulders. When we talk about how do we base our knowledge if the ruling class is, teaching us all the wrong things, we're standing on the shoulders of revolutionaries who succeeded in overthrowing imperialism, and we base our knowledge in what happened there, right? And we want to take that and apply it to the conditions here in the U.S. So we are dead serious about building a party that can do this. So join us, y'all.